Welcome back to the afternoon session of the first day of DeepSec. We are here in Wright, Pirouette, and we are now have a talk from Joe Slowick about the old question of defense versus offense. Thank you.
Hello, ich heiße Joe Slowick. I have now exhausted my German, unless I want to order a beer or something, so I trust everyone's German or English is better than my German in this audience, so thank you for having me in my native language. So we'll talk about a topic of, really almost a purple teaming concept of comparing how it is that we approach offensive actions within the industrial control space, and then how that can inform defensive response and the interplay between the two by looking at examples of recent events. Now, before we get into that, who am I? So my background is I'm a defender at heart. I got my start in the U.S. government. I was a U.S. military officer for some time, naval officer to be specific, and then I ran the incident response team at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the USA. However, while I've been doing quite a few things for the government, these days I'm doing things a little bit differently, still defending, but now on my own terms as part of Dragos, which is an industrial control system security company, really focusing on threats wherever they are and whatever they may be, because at the end of the day, when we start talking about industrial control systems, we're talking about the things that ensure the quality and standards of life that we're used to in modern society, and anyone or everyone involved in such networks and intruding in them or attempting to disrupt or degrade them is wrong. So whoever you are in these environments, the idea is that I want to find you and kick you out. So what are we going to talk about today? So first, to sort of set the stage, we'll talk about a history of industrial control system events. Then move on to what sort of evolution have we observed in terms of tradecraft over time to bring us to where we are right now in terms of what attacks look like in the wild. To illustrate this more concretely, we'll talk about some case studies from actual events and how this represents the sort of current status of what offense looks like, and then go into future expectations for both what's needed from an offensive-minded perspective, including a red teaming pen testing perspective, and what's required of defenders in order to keep pace with offensive evolutions. So first and foremost, what is an industrial control system? Just so that we're on the same page. It was brought up earlier in the keynote talking about the OT environment. We're going to have a fairly circumscribed definition of what an industrial control system is. So really, focusing only on those items that are allowing for the automation, control, maintenance, monitoring of plant environments. So energy generation and distribution, water treatment and purification, factory environments. What we're going to avoid is everything that gets bundled up into the IoT environment, or as we all perhaps more affectionately know it as, the Internet of Shit. So rather than approaching everything from baby monitors to, I guess, the earlier talk about internet-connected dildos, instead we're really just going to focus on the industrial aspects, although I suppose if you have a very interesting dildo, that might be industrial strength. I'm going to try to avoid the bad jokes from now on. So now that we look at industrial control systems for what they are, what have we actually seen in these environments in terms of attacks? What's the history of this look like? Well, really, if we're talking about genuine, targeted, focused events within the industrial space, there's only a handful of things to really look at going back for the last 10 or so years. So there's ICS-focused malware, starting with, from a publicly acknowledged standpoint, Stuxnet had to be said eventually. I think this is the first mention of Stuxnet at this conference, so yay me for breaking that taboo. But then things start accelerating a little bit from there, with Stuxnet really serving as an outlier, both in terms of technical capability and its targeting specificity. So we had events then leading to the still somewhat mysterious 2014 German steel mill event, something that the BSI noted in one of their annual reports and for which there's still very little information, at least publicly available today. And then we start getting an acceleration of disruptive attacks of the 2015 Ukraine event, leveraging Black Energy 3, not ICS-specific malware, rather a remote access tool. It's not really a Trojan. I prefer tool because it's not mimicking something else. It's just there as a means of getting into an environment and just turning things off. Then elements start getting a little bit more automated, and we see some disruptive, borderline destructive bespoke malware deployed in order to affect ICS environments. In the 2016 Ukraine event, the crash override attack, and then most recently, at least most recently that we were all publicly aware of, the 2017 Trisis or Triton event affecting an oil and gas facility in Saudi Arabia. So it might seem that there's not that many things going on, but certainly some scary things. And what's important to note as well is that in framing these as attacks or intrusions, that really we're trying to focus on not just survey, reconnaissance, stealing intellectual property, but genuine attempts to disrupt, degrade, or even potentially destroy. Because those are the things that are, quite honestly, most concerning and can have the biggest potential effect when we're talking about active industrial processes. But since we've talked about what is an ICS attack, what's not an ICS attack? And this ranges fairly broadly from actual events, malicious events that are certainly maybe related to industrial environments, to things that are simple fear, uncertainty, and doubt media reporting, or just bad stories. So for example, the ESET team did a really good job in reporting on gray energy recently, but when this story got picked up in the media, an industrial aspect to it was emphasized when, very similar to Black Energy 3, which is something that came out in ESET's reporting, it's a tool. It's a tool that can be applied in multiple environments, but it's not specifically designed to disrupt or impact an industrial environment. Similarly, Maersk with the NotPetya outbreak, yes, it was very impactful, it was very scary and very bad day for Maersk, but not necessarily targeted malware. It was a IT intrusion that spun out of control and resulted in some disruptive events. And then we start getting into things that are just bullshit. So everything from the Turkish pipeline incident, which was initially like, it must be malware. That's probably not malware, to even companies making up malware, like the Clear Energy ransomware that wasn't really ransomware, but rather a marketing stunt. So what's important to note about these is that by expanding scope to include things that either are legitimate problems but not focused, all the way to generating that sort of hype around items, is that we can lose context and a lot of valuable lessons around what actually constitutes an industrial attack. So in looking at ICS events in general, we certainly see lots of reconnaissance and initial access attempts. People are knocking on the door, so to speak, trying to enumerate, identify, and get into these environments. But we're only seeing a handful of events that really get to that ultimate status of deny, degrade, destroy, which is a good thing. We certainly don't want many events that could result in industrial processes failing or being disrupted in some sense. But it is interesting to note that there's been a significant increase in a lot of what we're seeing in these initial attack vectors that could lead to later on events. So the key question is what's bridging this gap, and how do we get there from both a testing perspective, since we're all white hats here, so we'll talk from a testing and not an actual attack perspective, as well as from a defensive perspective. To orient this back into the evolution of malware, though, it's very interesting in looking at how things have progressed over time. So we've touched upon this fairly briefly already. So Stuxnet itself represents an outlier. It's almost not worth talking about because in terms of technical sophistication, capability, and what it was designed to do in its targeted environment, it is still dramatically different from everything that has come since. So it's sort of out there on its own. Since that happened, which then generated everyone being interested in industrial control security, we've had a profusion of malware or tools, perhaps would be a better way of putting it, designed around the industrial space. So Havix came along not that long after Stuxnet was disclosed, part of the Dragonfly campaign in Europe, US, North America, etc., allowed for the automated collection and probing of industrial gear. Moving into Black Energy 2, which did have an industrial component and having certain capabilities designed towards some manufacturer human-machine interface devices. And then as we start getting into the actual disruptive attacks, what we start seeing is from Black Energy 3, again, it's not ICS malware, rather just a tool that was used to allow an adversary to get into the environment and then basically just turn something off in order to create a disruption. But we're starting to see that shift towards actual disruptive events. As we move past Black Energy 3 into Crash Override and Trisis, now we start developing effects modules, specialist, or maybe not so specialist, but at the very least ICS manipulation capability automated or encoded in software rather than relying upon the person on keyboard to understand what's going on and do something manually. So this certainly increases the ability to scale and how you can replay attacks across multiple environments potentially. So from a trend perspective, what we've seen is that attacks have gotten more aggressive over time, culminating in that Trisis event, which we'll go into detail in a little bit. And that really goes to show that there's a heightened degree of risk tolerance on the part of adversaries, because if you throw an exploit in a standard IT environment and it results in a blue screen, like, yes, Phil in accounting is having a bad day and he'll need his system rebuilt. If you blue screen a HMI or an engineering workstation in a plant environment, though, or impact something a little further down the scale, like a programmable logic controller, you've not only disrupted that from a logical perspective, but your oops moment also results in physical repercussions, which are quite serious. And the fact that we're seeing more adversaries pursue these sort of physical attacks and getting into these environments to that degree means that we're seeing adversaries accepting that risk that, yes, we might screw up, resulting in something like the 2014 German steel mill event, where a steel mill ended up sort of just destroying itself to a certain degree, on up to the Trisis event, where the impact to a safety system could have resulted in an unsafe condition that could have threatened or endangered someone's life within that environment. So in terms of overall tradecraft, really, sort of legacy, and it's very funny speaking legacy because we're only talking about going back to 2015, 2016, is that, we've seen a lot of custom malware and tools, Havoc, for example, and the Black Energy variants, with exploits leveraged to various degrees. But then when it came to the actual ICS impact portion of it, again, the 2015 Ukraine event was really just someone getting into the system and manually interacting with it in order to cause an outage. Not terribly sophisticated, but those previous steps certainly involved some blood, sweat, and tears from a technical perspective. Currently, though, what we're now seeing is a shift, whereas instead of having that tech debt early on within the process, instead that's been moved back to the final stages of the attack, both from specialist ICS knowledge for how an attack will take place and encoding those effects within software, but then in earlier stages, using sort of commodity techniques that many of us who may have a pen testing background would be familiar with as the means of both getting into networks and facilitating spreading throughout them to get in position to deliver a final attack payload. Now, what's important about this, and this was something that was brought up in the keynote this morning, although I don't have a picture of a cute or very horrifying monkey-elephant hybrid, is that we've seen this IT-ification, or the extension of IT technologies within OT environments, which is a good thing if you're an MBA, or if you're an accountant, or if you're a plant engineer and you want increased efficiency and the ability to have greater flexibility in the operation of a plant environment. It's resulted in things like a lot of the assumptions that have come in the past that industrial environments are air-gapped, or the technologies are so separate or so unique that not just any hacker or red teamer can understand them. Instead, we've really brought a lot of fundamental aspects of the very standard Windows IT Active Directory environment into industrial spaces. But we've done so while at the same time not being able to bring in some of the things that as defenders we've gotten used to from a defense mitigation and recovery standpoint. There are no good advanced endpoint solutions. Antivirus can legitimately get in the way of things sometimes. Update cycles, because you're operating at the ebb and flow of industrial processes rather than Patch Tuesday cycles, means that you're not applying the latest and greatest patches in time. And from a remediation standpoint, does your response team even know how to wipe, rebuild, and restore a programmable logic controller, including whatever ladder logic it's operating on? So the freedom of movement from a defensive standpoint is sufficiently smaller within these environments, yet we've brought on all of the attack surface that we've come to know and hate from IT environments into industrial environments. Furthermore, when it comes to IT intrusions, while we still see, custom malware, your Sophices, or, however you want to call it, pick a name or whatever, among other items, most of our adversaries, whether from crimeware groups all the way up to your state-sponsored advanced persistent threat groups, are really reducing their use of custom malware, increasing their emphasis on system tools, living off the land techniques, representing a fundamental shift in attacker behavior. You could argue it's more of a going back to an earlier stage of offensive operations, yet we see this in terms of an ebb and flow with events over time. How this represents itself is that the legitimate now becomes the malicious. So cmd.exe calling various Windows commands in order to manipulate or otherwise allow for attacker control of systems, using scripting frameworks in order to run within memory, PowerShell being the obvious one, but also WMI and VBA from a delivery perspective, using legitimate tools like PSExec and other examples within the sysinternals suite for remote process execution or for survey activity. And then why bother having some very hokey XOR encoded command and control schema when I can just use a Let's Encrypt cert and contact things over HTTPS, or just build an SSH tunnel or VNC right to a victim host. In a lot of respects, this is not just simplifying things, but from a defensive standpoint in IT environments, we've become used to these as being challenges to detect, which are even more challenging when we start getting into the industrial space because of the limitation in capability and visibility. Specifically, this extension of the IT threat landscape to ICS environments is very worrisome because we don't have the same degree of host visibility, the same possibility for mitigation or automatic stopping or similar detection options within these environments. And thus we've enabled and incentivized attacks that move away from things that might be able to get picked off by legacy antivirus fairly consistently and easily towards things that blend in with legitimate engineering and administration operations within the environment. So now that we've said that and we're investigating things like living off the land, pen tester 101 sort of techniques, how does this relate to industrial networks again? Well, first, it's very important to recognize that an industrial-focused attack is not simply a bolt from the blue surprise, but rather it's the culmination of multiple discrete steps along a kill chain, not a copyrighted Lockheed Martin kill chain, but the SANS ICS cyber kill chain, where this final goal of executing an ICS attack can only be reached, with some exceptions, if you really go through a number of prior dependent steps in order to get there. Getting into the IT environment, identifying a way to both persist in there and then make a jump over to the control system environment, and then figure out what you're operating, well, what the defended environment is operating, what equipment is there, what vulnerabilities exist, how to exploit those or how to take advantage of those in some ways, and then and only then leading up to that final ICS attack. So what we've seen is that all of these prior stages, your intrusion and lateral movement, are leveraging increasingly these commodity tools, living off the land techniques, and avoiding those custom tools and tradecraft, which are very good for developing signatures, whether you're talking network intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, or host-based items like YARA rules or AV, and really only getting into this specific software at that very end of the kill chain stage, where I need a custom tool designed for this specific piece of equipment that is not in very many environments, but is necessary for executing an attack in my target environment. So on the plus side, there's little scope for direct replay between ICS-specific tools because thankfully it's still a very fragmented environment, and you still have a lot of things like custom OSs and custom proprietary vendor protocols, etc. But what it means is that all of the steps leading up to that are things that are not just well within the means of many adversaries, but which many adversaries have, quite frankly, been trained on because they're used to operating within the standard Windows IT environment. So if we're orienting this to our kill chain, then, our initial repeatable tactics, techniques, and procedures, again, I was in the military, so I use words like that a lot. I'm trying to break that habit, but it's obviously not successful. We're seeing this across multiple stages leading up to that final attack scenario. These are the things that, on the one hand, they seem simple, yet they're incredibly effective as a means of getting into these environments, getting into position in order to deliver some ultimate effect. And then, and only then, we're seeing the typical custom-developed software designed to do some sort of malicious impact at that final stage. So as we're applying tradecraft across the kill chain, what does this actually look like? Well, from an initial access perspective, everyone in the room is familiar with how you get into networks these days. The phishing, watering hole attacks, maybe remote access if you harvest some credentials and then just RDP or SSH into the victim network. It always sounds like, how could anyone ever allow this to happen? And yet we know how networks are built. It happens. But there's definitely a focus on credential harvesting because the capture and use of legitimate credentials within the environment, especially administrator credentials, then fuels everything past that, because all of these techniques that involve some extent of using native system tools require privileged access. That may seem to be the linchpin, or the central point of defense, and yet in most cases, because we don't see very good implementations of multi-factor authentication, or we have local administrators running on every system within the network, it's still not very difficult for attackers to get that level of access. Once you have that, then we start seeing things like, from a lateral movement perspective, there's no need to start throwing exploits if I can just remotely authenticate to hosts within the network, remotely execute processes via psexec or via net use commands, or scheduling tasks remotely, etc. From a survey and information gathering perspective, it comes up in things like your SANS classes or your offensive security classes, but the nation state guys are using Nmap just as well, and maybe occasionally a custom port scanner. And then doing things like gathering documents, both to try and harvest passwords, but also to try and determine how does this network set up, what is it that I'm going after, enabling that final pivot to the ICS network, where the same sort of techniques are simply replayed in order to allow for further spread throughout the network, albeit now with a focus on trying to identify where are the control systems of interest that I need to compromise or get access to in order to have some sort of disruptive or destructive effect. And then at this ICS attack phase, do we see attacks that are narrowly targeted and tailored to the environment in question based upon what equipment is running, not just what equipment, but what firmware revision, what processor board, as we'll see with the Trisis example. So applied across the kill chain, everything prior to this last point, everyone in this room can probably do fairly effectively to some degree or another. Now, you might get caught. This is why CTFs are not very good ways of trying to test defenses, because they're typically very noisy and you scan everything and who cares what the hell happens. But from a sophisticated attacker standpoint, those same techniques, albeit used with a certain degree of operational security, are not just effective but preferable for getting into and moving throughout these environments. So we've talked about what we are seeing. What aren't we seeing? Almost no observed use of 0 days. We started out the conversation by talking about Stuxnet. I think that's the last time I say that in this talk. Couple of Windows 0 days, as well as some vulnerabilities within the Siemens Step 7 devices that were targeted. Since then, though, with the exception potentially of Trisis, although that's a debate whether that's an actual 0 day or not, the vulnerabilities really aren't targeted. Instead, the vulnerabilities we're talking about are Windows vulnerabilities. MS-1710, your SMB vulnerability that led to WannaCry, sort of NotPetya, among other things, is going to be dramatically more impactful in industrial environments than any ICS cert, Siemens, ABB, whatever vulnerability that's come out within the last few years, because it allows for a certain universality of application, and it's very effective at spreading throughout these networks. And finally, what we're seeing is, instead of custom software, publicly available tools. Let me repurpose Cobalt Strike. Let me use PowerShell Empire. Interpreter runs in memory. That works out just fine as long as I'm not putting myself in a position to get caught by AV because I'm dropping it to disk or something else. Why go to, no attacker gets bonus points or gets a salary increase because they use some very sophisticated and fancy technique. They get rewarded based on success. And why work harder than you have to, especially when things you can pull off of GitHub are going to be just as, if not more effective than the very fancy custom developed in-house software. All right, so we've talked about the landscape, what's going on in terms of tradecraft. What does this actually look like in practice, though? So, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, there's a handful of full-scope attacks. I said I wasn't going to mention that first one again, so you can read it. I'm not going to say it. After that, though, we had Crash Override and the Trisis Triton event as really being the only sort of full-scope initial access through an ICS attack phase events that we know of right now. There may have been a few events where a adversary mistake resulted in an impact and some other things, but really these are the events from which we can learn the most because they represent a true start-to-finish ICS-specific disruptive event. So to start, we'll talk about Crash Override. So this was the second Ukrainian power outage, the 2016 event, where a Ukrenergo substation in the greater Kiev area was attacked, for lack of a better term, that resulted in an outage for about 30 minutes. Doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. Certainly from a demonstration perspective, quite significant, but you can You can argue that this was not a very impactful attack, but from a technical perspective, it definitely represented an evolution in capability. Now, having said that, some of you may be wondering, like, well, haven't we talked about this already ad nauseum? We have kind of. Actually, if you're very interested in this from a very detailed perspective, I recommend looking at the presentation I gave at this year's Virus Bulletin on all of the precursor steps leading up to crash override. But in addition to that, working with, and maybe not as much with as I'd like, with ESET, as they referred to this as in Destroyer. We did a joint Black Hat discussion on this back in 2017. There's been some other reporting. This might seem to be a very well-covered event, and yet, when this was initially brought to attention, it was treated as one of those sort of bolt from the blue items where the ICS attack just manifested itself out of seemingly nothing, brought out of thin air. So as much as the event was seemingly documented, there was very little information about how that ICS network was accessed, how that ICS capability was delivered and executed within the environment, and all of the contextual items that you would need to build up a layered defense-in-depth situation. So if we look at this from a high level, how the attack progresses, it's the same as sort of any other theoretical attack. You need to penetrate the network, establish a foothold, figure out what systems and protocols are in play, and then deliver your attack. The thing is that none of this happens in an hour or a day or a week, maybe a couple of months. So all of these stages require time, effort, and work in order to make these happen. Those are all opportunities from a defender's perspective to catch this in action and mitigate something before you get to this final stage of executing an actual disruptive event. So looking at crash override in context, it required significant prepositioning, knowledge of the network in question, and the ability to move throughout in order to cause some sort of a impact. Thus, months of preparation, at least 2.5-ish, give or take, based upon log data, were required in order to build up access points, laterally move through the network, and then develop and deliver a capability to impact the fundamental industrial processes in play. Now, when we talk about what enabled this to happen, we're not talking about very sophisticated stuff. So a packed and an unpacked copy of Mimikatz, which seems trivially easy, like that should get picked up no problem by antivirus. In this case, for whatever reason, it did not because of where it was introduced into the environment. PSExec for remote execution, lots and lots of scripts, and not just obfuscated PowerShell scripts. In fact, there was no obfuscation of any scripts that we identified as part of this attack whatsoever. And only a couple of custom items. There was a custom port scanner, nothing too sophisticated there, and there was a backdoor remote access tool. ESET has since reported on this further and linking it to the I believe they refer to them as telebots, sandworm, something bear. Which bear are they again? Venomous bear. So there's some code overlap there, but when we look at that custom backdoor, which is the focus of a lot of initial analysis, including my own before having access to some additional information, the backdoor didn't show up in the network until almost right before the attack in question. So while file metadata has the compilation timestamp wiped out, artifacts within the PDB, among other items in the executable itself, show that this was compiled and delivered basically hours before the attack itself was executed. Thus, the attacker's ability to persist in this network and manipulate it in some way was dependent upon something other than this one custom tool for which it's trivially easy to write a detection signature for. Instead, what they were using are things like this. This is a VBS script. This looks like something you could probably pull off of TechNet or Stack Overflow that just does nothing but copy files over. There are other examples from the same script file. It's very lengthy, so I didn't want to take up a whole slide or test your vision with it, but it's the same sort of idea. Everything is very well written out. It's fairly good code, and really just designed to do things like move files, copy files, execute files, etc. Things that look very much like a standard Windows system administrator's toolkit. And yes, the attacker used PowerShell, but they weren't trying to be very sneaky about it. So the PowerShell script in question that was executed in this environment to bring down another executable payload features no obfuscation whatsoever. I would like to think that if you're logging and monitoring PowerShell, this would stick out like a very sore thumb and at least provide some impetus to analyze. But if you're not logging PowerShell to begin with, you don't even have the opportunity to try and investigate this as a potential anomalous or suspicious event. So why bother hiding if you know you don't need to, because this is going to fly completely underneath the detection radar for the environment in question. And then to launch the attack, instead of relying on some sophisticated code inject or injecting into memory, all the attacker did was remotely create services using scconfig to call the crash override launcher module, passing it call the crash override loader, passing it the appropriate effects module along with a configuration file, sending it to auto start, and then letting the hard-coded timer within the file tick down to when it was supposed to deliver the outage. Again, nothing terribly sophisticated here, and if you're doing the level of host-based monitoring and auditing that ideally you should, and in many IT environments that we are, this will stick out because, or hopefully it does, or at least shows up if you're auditing things like service creation. So overall, the attack flows from starting this launcher through that service start, executing the payload, then firing off a wiper to delete certain files, and then as a post-attack mechanism, leaving behind a backdoor to allow for access to the network again. And then there was a denial of service using a Siemens Supertech vulnerability that was actually miscoded, which is hilarious. We don't have time to get into that right now, but attackers aren't perfect. They make mistakes as well. So again, we have multiple phases to the attack, but all of this is requiring those sort of, pen tester 101 techniques in order to get everything in place in order to launch this. So enabling factors for this attack were really just poor visibility, especially when it comes to the host environment. Remote access was, was leveraged heavily in this attack in order to permit the attacker to move throughout the environment, and the lack of things like multi-factor authentication mean that once you harvested a credential, along with the fact that the set of credentials that were used in this environment were repeated across all boxes, you had ample opportunity to move throughout it through simple things like scripting and net use commands. So the only thing that looks like malware arrives just before the final disruptive attack. It doesn't buy you any time whatsoever to try and respond, even if you do catch it at that point. So really, that initial intrusion and prep is where you want to be in terms of detection and response. But because it's blending in or remains invisible depending upon your detection framework, you might not be giving yourself the chance in order to respond appropriately. So our next example is the Trisis event. So this garnered its own set of headlines because it's an ICS event. Of course it's going to hit the media and be quite popular. The event itself targeted a gas facility in Saudi Arabia in June to August of 2017. The event resulted in a system shutdown, not because of something that the malware did, but rather because of something in the malware that messed up. We're still not quite sure what that was. The attack itself, and this goes back to attacks being very specific to the environment in question, focused on the Schneider Electric Triconix 3008 PowerPC processor version running firmware revision 10.4 is what this would be applicable to. Don't quote me on the firmware version number. I think it might be 10.2 or something. But anyway, the idea being here is that we're talking about an attack that's extremely narrowly focused on what was running in this environment, thus little scope for replay unless you're running the same exact sort of hardware with the same firmware on it. So to put this in context, what Trisis targeted was the safety system. Safety systems, as the name implies, are designed to make sure that the industrial environment maintains or fails to a known safe state. Compromising a safety system gives you a couple of options. You can either have safe conditions recorded as unsafe and thus producing a plant shutdown, or more worrisome, you can modify safety logic such that unsafe conditions are monitored as being safe and thus allow the plant environment to get into an extremely dangerous situation, producing the possibility at least for physical damage or even harm to or loss of human life. Now, looking at the Trisis attack, again, it's not something that just happens. There are multiple stages prior to that. You need to establish access onto the safety controller, which has all of the prerequisites very similar to crash override in terms of getting in position to launch this in the first place, but then transfer some payload to that safety system, launch it, and then some other steps in order to get to the point where you've actually disrupted and compromised the safety system. Within the Trisis attack specifically, something messed up here, which is why we had a shutdown, but not necessarily one of the scary scenarios that I mentioned earlier. So put in detail, the adversary built and deployed a rootkit for this specific safety system, a non-trivial tactical feat involving reverse engineering and software development to put all this into play. The ultimate purpose is unknown, but looking at the attack itself, it's the culmination of months, maybe even years of activity resulting in an attack that's really only going to work in a handful of places worldwide. From an enabling perspective, how did this attack get into the environment? Not as clear as crash override on this one, unfortunately, but looking at the details that are available, we had some custom executables as tools, nothing very sophisticated, Mimikatz functionality for credential theft and replay, and then some simple but effective backdoor tools. Overall, while there was immense resources put into developing that rootkit on the safety system, not a whole lot was invested in these stages of the attack. Nothing that stands out as being especially fancy, unique, or complex in terms of design or capability. So from a pre-attack perspective, really all this is looking to do is support and enable that follow-on ICS attack. So get into the network, establish infiltration and exfiltration routes, command and control, and then don't get caught. There's some evidence that payloads were caught, specifically the credential theft items, but were not sufficient enough in order to ensure that this event was at least well remediated and the attacker kicked out. So the enabling mission here is to harvest credentials to pivot. There are indications in this environment that the adversary defeated a two-factor authentication schema that was put into play in this network because they had compromised the environment as that was being installed, and thus were able to add a phone number to the SMS-based authentication mechanism so that they could use two-factor authentication themselves, but ultimately they were able to defeat VPN security measures, thus, a little more secure than what we saw with crash override, but still not something that was so rock solid as to prevent an attack. What the attacker avoided, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of complex compiled malware that as defenders we love seeing because it's, even if we don't know exactly what it's doing, it's pretty obvious it's bad. They didn't use any custom C2 mechanisms, SSH tunnels, and some things along those lines. Not a whole lot of things you can build signatures around depending upon your environment and what's going on. The result is that the adversary activity is able to blend in with legitimate activity or perceived commodity attacks. So for example, you catch Mimikatz in your network. Are you necessarily, depending on who you are, and I'm guessing in this room that everyone would run this down pretty thoroughly, but depending upon what you have to deal with, what your workflow is like, oh, we caught a credential theft, it doesn't look like it's really related to anything else, wipe, rebuild it, kick it out of the network, reset that password, and move on to the next thing. Looking as sort of, low-tech or less sophisticated methodologies lulls defenders into a false sense of confidence if something's found, not to do the extra work to try and dig out a potential advanced persistent threat intrusion. So looking at Trisis, it's a bifurcated attack. There's a complex endgame involved in terms of that rootkit that's put on the safety system, but all enabled through commodity code and effectively blending in with how that network is operated on a day-to-day basis. Furthermore, the adversary behind Trisis has not gone away. They're still active, and they're getting even more reliant upon these sorts of techniques. So initial survey activity is just scraping web pages and doing things like looking for authentication portals and researching things like PowerShell script frameworks that are available on GitHub, among other places, to replace some of the custom post-exploitation items that were in the original Trisis event. So this adversary is learning, and they're only going further along this route. So what are our expectations? So currently, ICS defense capabilities often overlook host and process-based monitoring, which is bad because the adversaries will continue migrating towards what works and what's effective. They'll go where they can't be seen. Thus, host-based commands and in-memory execution on Windows workstations, which are now quite popular and profuse within industrial networks, will continue as, just for the simple reason that it's not that hard, it works, and it's very effective. That emphasizes this attack bifurcation, that for your preparatory and pre-industrial control attack phases, seeing avoidance of custom software, emphasis on commodity and system tools, reliance on in-memory execution. And then from an ICS attack perspective, we are getting more complex as a lot of the specialist operator knowledge about how these systems work, what sort of commands are necessary, are instead embedded in software through custom attack tools and not relying on an operator to enter these things on keyboard. The implications for offense are interesting. So from your attackers and APTs, continue to do what works. No one gets bonus points for being more complex than anyone else. Instead, focus on what system dependencies exist for access and intrusion and follow up on them. From a red team and pen tester perspective, though, this gets interesting, and this goes back to how there's a glorification of things like the zero-day exploit and the fancy hacks and whatnot. When adequately testing a lot of these environments, and the message that we perhaps want to make sure we're sending to asset owners and operators is that Defense in depth means that we don't overemphasize that final exotic ICS attack, but rather bringing greater focus onto the approaches to those final attack stages and what techniques we're seeing adversaries actually adopt. It doesn't sound very sexy or very exciting, but it maps to what we're seeing in the threat environment right now and calls attention to the sorts of things that defenders need to start embracing to make sure that they're keeping pace with how attackers are actually operating. So attackers are just being enabled because the expansion of IT systems in ICS, combined with the lack of visibility and response that we're now used to in IT environments, don't exist to produce an attacker advantage. So if you're trying to test the security stance of an ICS network, don't focus on that final stage of trying to identify the latest and greatest zero-day vulnerability for some embedded system. Instead, look for the things where defenders can actually legitimately do something meaningful to improve defense and what's being leveraged to get to this point to begin with. All of these prerequisites in order to get into a position where an attack can take place. That gets ignored a lot of times, unfortunately. So as a takeaway, general Windows network intrusion skills are really what you need in order to make at least the initial stages of these attacks possible. Specialist knowledge is required, but only at the very end, and even then, depending upon what you're trying to do, if you're not trying to scale up especially well or not trying to do something like develop a custom rootkit for a very specific platform, you can just log onto a system and turn things off. It's not very sophisticated, but guess what? That was the 2015 Ukraine attack. Not exactly the most sophisticated element in the world. Well, what about implications for defense? So first off, as we mentioned multiple times, adversaries are going to do what works. Current detection and defense environments favor living off the land techniques because we lack the visibility required in order to meet what is currently popular and effective from an attack standpoint. So defense needs to adapt visibility and detection towards what's going on, but also, and that final point is very important, be flexible and agile enough so that when that inevitably changes, that we catch that, whether through good threat intelligence or monitoring what our vulnerabilities and our threat landscape exists for our own environments, to adapt to what attackers move to once we close off these attack pathways. So from a defensive standpoint, we need visibility, response, and remediation. Getting a little short on time, so I'm going to hurry through these a little bit. My apologies. So really, it's identifying what do we need to see, what capabilities do we need to respond, and then lastly, from a defensive standpoint, how do I know or how can I assure myself that I can restore a given system to not just a known good, but because we're talking about industrial environments, a known safe state. To do that, and to try and get the most amount of flexibility in order to capture things, I like to talk about articulating attacks as behaviors. So you identify attack trends, map those to adversary behaviors, like I need remote process execution, I need command and control, and then determine how those behaviors look in place. So oftentimes we focus on IOCs, which are these observables here, which are really just very specific instantiations of a fundamental behavior that could be leveraged through PowerShell execution or through creating SSH tunnels. So instead of living off the IOCs, try and figure out ways in order to detect what are the sort of general attack methodologies that underlie that specific indicator of compromise. When implemented as defense, you identify those behaviors of interest, define means for the behavior to achieve objectives within target, determine what visibility you have around those behaviors within your environment, and then build detections around the result. When applied via hunting, the idea here isn't just to run the MD5 hash or look for this C2 domain, but rather, what's the attack vector of interest? What sort of data do you have in order to go and look for this, like looking for things like process chaining or unsigned executing within my environment, formulating some hypothesis to sort of articulate that search in such a way so that it's testable and repeatable, and then if it's really good, to revise and repeat as necessary. So ultimately what we want to do is we want to build defense in depth. So identifying common requirements that are needed as we see attackers sort of migrate towards the same general ideas of how to compromise these networks, building detection and visibility around what we're observing within the threat environment, and then implementing these as alerts and responses. I want to make sure that we have time for questions, so I'm going to stop here. These slides will be made available at some point. I have a list of references, both that were used to build this talk and that might be useful for further reading. The blue on blue is very terrible. My apologies for that one. I'll blame the graphic artist who put together this slide template. But with that, I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I would love to get to whatever we can here or out in the hall later.
Thanks. We have some minutes for questions. Any questions?
Thank you. Quick question about the response from the regulators' point of view. I mean, what is happening actually today, even on Ukraine, where it's obvious that Russians are, using Ukraine as a sort of test bed for that kind of attacks. I don't see any response from like governments, like international organizations. Do you have any opinion on why is it silent?
I think it's a combination, and this is something to steal from my boss, company founder Rob Emily for Dragos or whatever, that there's also, on one aspect, it's the idea that, oh, Ukraine, it's on the other side of the world, or it's like, it's Ukraine, it's not our problem, it's the Ukrainians' problem. The Russians or whoever would never try to do this to us for whatever reason. Yet we've seen since mid-2017, especially in the US, the UK, and potentially Germany, that's not the case, that there's been active attempts to map out and get into these sorts of networks. So it is a problem. The second part is that while we've seen good movement in certain regulatory aspects, like NERC-CIP is usually brought up as an example, it's been more of a audit and check in the box sort of if that doesn't translate very well, my apologies, exercise, than actually going towards a robust designing and implementing defense perspective. Unfortunately, I think the only thing that's going to really push us to doing these sorts of things or mandating them and pushing for them more aggressively is having something bad happening in a place that someone's actually going to notice and care.
A very short question here, and then we have to stop.
Should be a quick question. You said that, is there also a change in the business model of the attackers? So, I mean, in the past they were very specific, required a lot of money, so most likely governmental funded or otherwise sort of, do you see a change there also?
There is, to the extent that where you're seeing that emphasis in resources is being shifted less so on initial access and more towards the final stage. So I sort of disagree with what FireEye reported for their attribution for the Trisus Triton event, but tying it to a research laboratory in Russia, which makes a lot of sense because if you think about where you're going to start developing capabilities designed to and the reverse engineering required to build out an industrial specific attack capability, it's not something that is easily done or well funded. If we were able to do some of the reverse engineering around the Triconics device and the Tri-Station protocol, but we already knew what the end state was going to be, so we could cheat a little bit. To do something like this against a target system requires time, effort, smart people, and the money to pay them at least reasonably well. So I think what attackers have realized, at least in this space, is that instead of investing resources in something we don't need, those initial access tools, focus developments and capabilities on the final aspect, which enables the more complex sort of attacks that scale more effectively than the sort of human in the loop, just have someone get in there and start turning things off manually. Because you can only do that for a couple of devices at a time, whereas crash override, it didn't work correctly. If it had worked correctly, it would have been a much wider outage than was implemented because of the way that it was developed. So.
Okay, we have to stop here. Thank you very much, Joe. Thanks again.